Good morning, tiny people. Here we go again with another episode of Amendments to the Constitution. Some very important ones here. We're going from after the Bill of Rights, the ones enacted during the first sessions of Congress, all the way through the American Civil War. Now that ended in 1865, so it tells you it's about 2/3 of a century there. That's a long time to only come up with 5 more amendments. It's a slow process and it's meant to be so. They don't want people changing the fundamental law of the land on a whim. The 11th Amendment. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state, or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. What they're saying there is, again, they were thinking, geez, the power of the United States might be getting a little bit too strong in the central government. If there's a problem with a lawsuit between states dealing with each other, they can handle it in the state courts. All right, one of those big events in history that forced a change in the Constitution. The presidential election of 1850. Back then, at the start of the country's political process, the way people voted was they voted, and of course it still went to the Electoral College, or it already went to the Electoral College. And the Electoral College would vote, and we know it takes a certain number of votes to win. Well, after a couple of years of having had the Federalist Party in power, the people running against them on a party called the Democratic Republicans, not the Democrats, not the Republicans. The name of this party was the Democratic Republicans, and it was headed by Thomas Jefferson. His vice presidential running mate was a man named Aaron Burr. All you people can hiss if you saw Hamilton, because you know he's the bad guy. But listen to me carefully. They weren't seen as running mates. They hadn't declared that process yet. They were each running for president. The idea was clearly thought that Jefferson, leader of the party, would become the president and Aaron Burr the vice president. But the votes were tied. Each had 73 electoral votes, and Burr did not want to give up his chance. He was a very ambitious man. He wanted to be president of the United States. So he did not want to give up his chance. He did not agree to become vice president. As a result, it took a long time to work through, and finally, Thomas Jefferson was declared president. When we get there, I'll explain how Alexander Hamilton worked in all of that. But pretty much that's the biggest thing that made the blood feud between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. All right, the 12th Amendment. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. So presidents and vice presidents do not come from the same state. And actually, they pick and choose. Oftentimes, we've talked about those big voting states, the Californias, Texas, New Yorks, Illinois. They carry a lot of electoral votes, and oftentimes a candidate will choose a vice presidential running mate from one of those states to try to pull those electoral ballots over to their side. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president. So here's where we start to get that idea of a ticket. One person runs for president, another person runs for the office of vice president. They make distinct lists of all the persons voted for as president and everybody voted for as vice president. The number of votes for each, which list they shall sign and certify and transmit sealed to the seat of government of the United States, directed to the president of the Senate. Now he's going to open them and have a open counting of the ballots. And it says, if no person shall have such majority, then from the persons having the highest number, not exceeding 3, on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. So think about that now. You have, if you had a candidate, let's say last year's election, had it come down to it, the Democrats ran the House of Representatives. So that would have been up to the Democrats to choose the president. However, up until this last election, the Republicans had the majority in the Senate, and therefore It would have been, as you'll see in the next slide here, it's the Senate that chooses the vice president if it's thrown into contention. So it would have been possible to have uh, the Republican vice president candidate become the vice president and the Democratic presidential candidate become the president. It also says that no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. No, that's not a picture of Mr. Homan in his younger days. That's, remember, actor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who got to be governor of California, but could never have been vice president because he was not born an American citizen. And that's one of the constitutional eligibilities to the office of president. Now we get to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. These are called the Civil War Amendments. And I said there had to be something big in history in order to make the change, in order for us to take the framework, the fundamental rules of government, and change them in some meaningful way. Well, the American Civil War was about a few things, but primarily it was about slavery. Slavery was what really divided the country. To some people, they were arguing about an economic system. To some people, they were arguing about a moral system. Regardless, the answer was slavery. Now, the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, came into being because of how immense the disaster of the Civil War was. They used to think that it was about 500,000 people who had died in the war. And that's probably accurate if you just count the years during the war. However, historians have now gone back and looked at the census from 1870, the next census taken after the Civil War. And it turns out that it was closer to about 1.25 million people that went missing. They simply weren't on the census anymore. So they may have died from lingering wounds of the war or from diseases contracted during the war. But the fact of the matter is, historians now believe that it was probably closer to 1.25 million or 1.5 million men that died in the American Civil War. We couldn't allow that to happen again. We had to change, get rid of the fundamental reason for it. So the 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. All right. First of all, that picture is an actual American slave. Those are scars from actual whippings. That's not anything that's been photoshopped or made up. That's the brutality of slavery. Secondly, it says they can't have slavery or involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime someone's been convicted of, properly convicted of. So it is possible, and you might have heard this in movies or things, but it is possible to be sentenced to hard labor. That is, the work is part of the person's punishment. They can be forced to work. Oftentimes nowadays, it's seen almost as a privilege. Imagine if you were locked in a prison and your sentence was 25 years and you're going to be kept inside this little cell block, maybe a cell, maybe a small area inside a prison building. And now they come to you and say, would you like to work clearing a road? Would you like to help dam a stream? Would you like to get outside in the fresh air and be outside of this building? It might seem more like a privilege now. Another interesting thing about the wording in this, and it says, except as a punishment for the crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, not its jurisdiction, as in United States as one. Even after the Civil War, even after seemingly the idea that states could not be divided had become a fact because of the war, still that lingering idea that we were United States. And remember, a state is a distinct country, like the state of Israel or the state of France, the state of Great Britain. So they still had that idea in their wording, their jurisdiction for United States. The 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Okay. This was intended for the slaves who were alive when it was put into effect. It said, look, if someone is born in the United States, it doesn't matter what their condition used to be. If someone is born in the United States, then they are a citizen of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, where they live. Now, this has worked out differently over the years because it was intended for those people who had been slaves. You wouldn't think that it would last too long, but it certainly has. It's not what the intent was or the timing was, it's what the law says. That's what courts must enforce. Now, sometimes this works out in incredible ways. For example, Bruce Lee. I don't know if you've ever seen a Bruce Lee movie, but Bruce Lee was a martial artist, kind of guy that made martial arts movies popular. He was Chinese, but he had been born in the United States and was very early in life whisked back to China. And when he wanted to come back and go to college, he could come back because he was a citizen. They kept his paperwork. He had been born here. He was an American. He had dual citizenship. But now we've got some problems here. If you hear about the crisis at the border, all these people from Central and South America trying to rush across the southern border, that's what the picture at the right is. I mean, think about it. These social safety nets don't exist in a lot of other countries. Mexico is not a well-to-do country. So if somebody runs across the border and pops out their baby in the United States, they and the baby are guaranteed health care. The baby has a free education through 12th grade. The baby is immediately put with Social Security and food stamp collections. He's got all kinds of benefits that the baby gets because it is an American citizen. Americans take care of their citizens. So this is causing problems down on the border. The 14th Amendment, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, there are those natural rights again, without due process of law. Okay, that means they can't have those things taken away without going through all of the motions of a real court trial. It's really important that people have the chance to have counsel, have a lawyer, that they have a chance to have their day in court, that they can call witnesses, all the things in the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights that we talked about. Those are necessary in order to deprive a person of life, a death penalty, of liberty, jail, of property, of fine. All right. And then, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And again, the idea was to protect those freed former slaves because it was only reasonable if they are citizens of the United States that if the little white boy comes up and says, "Sheriff, you need to come, somebody's hurting my mama," that the sheriff ought to come. And if the little black boy comes up and says, "Sheriff, you need to come, somebody's hurting my mama," he also needs to come. He also needs to be there. The representatives of the law need to do what they have to make sure that each individual's life, liberty, and property is protected. All right. No votes for former slaves, no representation for them in Congress. Now, let me explain what this means. I'm not even going to read all of that. I just wanted to point out which part it was in your booklet. What the 3/5 clause said way back in the Constitution, remember that every slave counted as 3/5 of a person. So if there were 500,000 slaves in South Carolina, that counted the same as 300,000 free people. And back then, early on, it was about 30,000 people for each representative in the House of Representatives. That meant if they had 300,000 people, well, by gosh, that gave them another 10 representatives. And that's a lot of votes, a lot of power in Congress. Well, here, the National Congress says, look, if you allow the freed former slaves to vote, then they can get representation. Then you can count them for determining the number of seats you get in the House of Representatives. But if you do not, this is talking to each individual state, if you states do not allow the freed former slaves to vote, then you can't count them. Therefore, you'd have fewer representatives in Congress. You would have less political power. It was an important distinction. Now, there were a number of states from the former Confederacy, the old diehard slaveholding states. There were a number that said, all right, we'll let them vote. And there were a number that said, nope, we'll give up the representation, but we are not going to see them as equals. We're not going to treat them as equals. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I've got for today. With any luck, I will be back tomorrow. I sure would love to see your tiny smiling faces. Until then, work hard, take good notes, be good to each other, and say hello to Mrs. Hughes. Bye.